At 14:32 hours on April 11, 1945, Lieutenant Robert Klingman's hands were frozen to the stick. 28,000 feet above the Pacific, his engine coughing on fumes, he aimed the gull-winged Shadow at the enemy bomber ahead. No ammunition, no fuel, no options. Just 12 feet of propeller blades spinning between him and a decision that would haunt or honor him forever. Metal screamed against metal, the cockpit shuddered, and in that moment every doubt anyone ever had about the Corsair dissolved into the thin, cold air of history. They called it the Ensign Eliminator, the bent-wing bastard. Some mechanics whispered it was a widowmaker with wings. When the F4U Corsair rolled out of the Vought factory in 1940, it didn't look like salvation, it looked like a problem wrapped in riveted aluminum. For the young men who flew it, the Corsair wasn't just metal, it was home, protection, and sometimes a coffin with wings. Kids from Kansas, Brooklyn, and Montana climbed into that cockpit, carrying more courage than experience, and prayed the bent-wing bird would bring them back. The Navy had asked for a fighter that could outrun, outclimb, and outfight anything the Japanese could throw at them. What they got was a monster, the most powerful engine ever mounted on a single-engine fighter, a massive 13-foot propeller that required those distinctive inverted gull wings just to keep the blades from kissing the carrier deck, and a cockpit positioned so far back that pilots joked they were flying from the cargo hold. Rex Beasel's design team had created something unprecedented. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine pumped out 2,000 horsepower, more than some locomotives. The airframe was built like a tank. The armament was devastating. 6.50 caliber machine guns that could shred an enemy fighter in seconds. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a killer. The prototype, when it first flew on May 29, 1940, hit 405 miles per hour, faster than any American fighter had ever gone. Test pilot Lyman Bullard walked away grinning. But that grin didn't last long. Carrier trials in 1941 revealed the Corsair's dark side. The long nose created a blind spot during landing approach that turned carrier decks into deadly guessing games. The landing gear bounced on touchdown, a phenomenon pilots grimly termed the bounce. The stall characteristics were vicious and unpredictable. During one test, the plane snapped into an inverted spin that killed the pilot before he could react. The Navy's response was brutal, rejected for carrier operations. For a carrier-based fighter, this was a death sentence. The Corsair was exiled to land-based Marine squadrons in the Pacific, units that needed planes desperately enough to learn how to fly the beast. Would you trust your life to a plane your own Navy rejected? February 13, 1943, Guadalcanal. VMF 124 became the first Marine squadron to take the Corsair into combat. Major William Geese led 12 pilots into what would become a crucible of blood, sweat, and aviation legend. The first missions were nightmares. Pilots discovered that all those warnings hadn't been exaggerations. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh later recalled, "You didn't fly the Corsair, you negotiated with it. Every landing was a controlled crash. Every takeoff was a roll of the dice." The plane's quirks were maddening. Oil streaks on the windshield made the visibility even worse. The cockpit overheated in the Pacific sun, turning the cramped space into an oven. The hydraulic system had its own mind. And that bounce, God, that bounce, claimed more Corsairs in landing accidents than Japanese fighters did in the first 3 months. But something strange started happening. The pilots who survived the learning curve discovered something the Navy engineers hadn't counted on. The Corsair was forgiving to those who respected it. The plane demanded precision, demanded commitment, demanded courage, and rewarded those qualities with performance that made Japanese fighter pilots radio warnings to each other. The Zero pilots had owned the Pacific skies since 1941. Their lightweight, nimble fighters could outturn anything America fielded. But they couldn't outdive a Corsair. They couldn't outclimb it, and when a Corsair pilot learned to use speed and altitude instead of turning fights, the mathematics of aerial combat shifted. Kenneth Walsh figured it out first. Use the climb rate. Dive on them with that massive engine screaming. Rake them with those 650s, extend away, climb back up. Never turn, never slow down, never let them dictate the fight. On May 13, 1943, Walsh encountered 4 Zeros over New Jersey. He climbed into the sun, rolled over, and came down like an avenging angel. 2 Zeros disintegrated under his guns before the others even knew he was there. The remaining pair tried to turn with him, a fatal mistake. Walsh didn't turn. He used his speed to extend, climbed back into position, and picked them apart one by one. When he landed back at Guadalcanal, his crew chief counted 127 bullet holes in his Corsair. Walsh had taken damage that would have destroyed a Zero, but that tank-like construction, that overbuilt airframe the engineers had argued about, had saved his life. The word spread. The Corsair could take punishment and keep flying. By mid-1943, the Corsair squadrons had become something the Japanese feared. The bent wing silhouette in the sky meant death was diving at 400 miles per hour. Gregory Pappy Boyington deserves his own chapter in this story. Before the war, he'd flown with the Flying Tigers in China. By 1943, he was 30 years old, ancient for fighter pilot standards, divorced, drinking too much, and looking for redemption. The Marine Corps gave him VMF 214, a squadron of misfits, malcontents, and troublemakers. They called themselves the Black Sheep. Boyington's philosophy was simple and terrifying: aggression without apology. While other squadrons developed careful tactics, Boyington led his men straight into Japanese formations with throttles firewalled and guns blazing. It shouldn't have worked. It definitely shouldn't have resulted in 97 confirmed kills in 84 days. But it did. On December 17, 1943, Boyington linked some word Corsairs against 40 Japanese fighters over Rabaul. Any sane commander would have turned back. Boyington radioed, "We're going in." For the next 20 minutes, the sky became a vertical knife fight. Boyington's plane absorbed damage that should have been fatal. Cannon rounds through the wing, hydraulics shot out, fuel leaking. He shot down 4 enemy fighters before limping home on fumes and prayer. His crew chief asked him if he was crazy. Boyington shrugged, "Maybe, but I'm alive and they're not." If you were Boyington's wingman, would you have followed him into that fight? Robert Hanson was different, quieter, more calculating, equally lethal. In his first 2 weeks of combat, he shot down 20 Japanese aircraft. 20. His Corsair became known as the Ghost Plane because Zeros would break formation and flee when they saw his distinctive markings. On January 24, 1944, Hanson was leading a strafing run at low altitude when ground fire caught him. His Corsair cartwheeled into the jungle at 300 miles per hour. He was 23 years old. 6 days later, they posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor. Walsh, Boyington, Hanson, and dozens of others proved that the Corsair wasn't just survivable, it was dominant. By late 1944, the kill ratio told the story. For every Corsair lost in air combat, Marine pilots were downing 11 Japanese aircraft. The Navy noticed. The Navy had been watching. All those carrier combat problems? Marine and Navy engineers had been quietly fixing them. The cockpit was raised 7 inches. The stall warning system was improved. Landing procedures were refined. By early 1944, the Corsair was ready for a second chance. VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, became the first Navy squadron to take the Corsair to carriers. Commander Tom Blackburn led his men aboard USS Bunker Hill in February 1944, and the plane that had been rejected 3 years earlier
proved it belonged. The carrier war was different from land-based operations. Longer missions, more variability in landing conditions, higher stress. The Corsair adapted, pilots adapted, and the legend grew. During the invasion of the Philippines, Corsair squadrons provided close air support that probably saved thousands of American lives. The plane's ability to carry bombs and rockets, up to 4,000 pounds of ordnance, made it a devastating ground attack platform. Japanese troops learned to fear the bent-wing bird as much as their pilots did. But it was the kamikaze threat that truly showcased the Corsair's capabilities. Starting in October 1944, Japanese pilots began using suicide tactics to devastating effect. Conventional interception tactics weren't enough. You needed speed to catch them, firepower to destroy them before they hit the ships, and durability to survive the inevitable hits from their gunners. The Corsair had all three. On April 6, 1945, during Operation 10 Go, Japanese forces launched one of the largest kamikaze attacks of the war, 355 aircraft, targeting the American fleet off Okinawa. Corsair pilots from multiple squadrons scrambled to intercept. For 8 hours, the sky was chaos. Lieutenant Phil Wilmot from VF-10 shot down 6 kamikazes in 45 minutes. His Corsair took hits from 3 different aircraft, but stayed in the air. When he finally landed on USS Intrepid, his plane had one working gun, no flaps, and holes you could fit a basketball through. He climbed out, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and said, "This plane wants you to live." The mechanics counted 247 holes in his Corsair. They patched it up and had it flying again the next day. Not all the Corsair's battles happened in the Pacific. While Marine aces grabbed headlines, Navy and Marine squadrons were fighting a different war in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, a war history often forgets. British Fleet Air Arm pilots flew Corsairs from carriers in the Atlantic, protecting convoys and hunting U-boats. French pilots flew them against German positions in southern France. New Zealand squadrons operated them in the Solomon Islands campaigns. The Corsair was becoming an international weapon. The mechanics deserve their place in this story. These were the men who kept the bent-wing birds flying in conditions that would make a modern mechanic quit. On Pacific Island bases, they worked in mud, rain, and jungle heat. Parts were scarce. Tools were improvised. But a Corsair with a blown engine at sunset would be flying combat by dawn, because a crew chief named Smith or Rodriguez or O'Brien refused to accept defeat. Sergeant James Sweat's crew chief, a man named Davis, whose first name history lost, once rebuilt a Corsair's entire hydraulic system using parts cannibalized from 3 different wrecks, a bicycle pump, and what he swore was pure stubborn anger. That plane flew 47 more combat missions. The ground crews painted kill marks on the planes. They painted nose art, fierce tigers, pinup girls, menacing skulls. Each one was a promise. This plane will bring its pilot home. Most of the time, they kept that promise. Was this patriotism, pride, or something deeper? A bond between man and machine forged in the fires of war. As 1945 progressed and American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, the air war intensified. The Corsair squadrons were flying from carriers positioned just miles from the Japanese coast, striking military targets, defending the fleet, and preparing for the invasion that would ultimately never come. The missions were brutal. Flak was murderous. Japanese fighter resistance, though diminished, was desperate and skilled. Every sortie could be the last. Lieutenant Robert Klingman's story, that moment we opened with at 28,000 feet, deserves its full telling now. On April 11, 1945, Klingman and his wingman spotted a Japanese reconnaissance plane high above Okinawa. They climbed to intercept, but at 28,000 feet, both Corsair's engines began failing in the thin air. Klingman's guns froze. His wingman turned back. Klingman didn't. The Japanese plane was radioing American fleet positions. Klingman advanced throttle, closed the distance, and did something no one had ever done. He used his propeller as a weapon. He pulled alongside the enemy bomber and carefully, deliberately chopped into its tail section with his spinning propeller. The sound was horrific. His Corsair shook like it was being torn apart. The Japanese plane's tail separated. The bomber fell, spinning, into the sea. Klingman's engine was dying. He was 75 miles from base with almost no fuel and severe damage. The glide home took 25 minutes. 25 minutes of silence except for the wind whistling through holes in his damaged airframe. He dead-stick landed at Kadena, rolling to a stop with the prop bent, the engine destroyed, and his hands still frozen to the controls. He received the Navy Cross. His Corsair was scrapped, too damaged to repair. But the story became legend. The pilot who used his plane as a close combat weapon and survived.
August 15, 1945, the war ended. The Corsair squadrons stood down. In 4 years of combat, these bent-wing birds had flown 64,051 combat sorties, shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft, and maintained an astounding 11-to-1 kill ratio in air-to-air combat. But the numbers don't capture what it meant to fly this machine into combat. Let's be honest about something history often glosses over. Not everyone came home. Not everyone who climbed into a Corsair cockpit climbed back out. The Corsair killed pilots during training. It killed them during routine flights. It killed them during combat. Some died from enemy action. Some died because the plane's demanding nature didn't forgive mistakes. Some died from mechanical failures that no amount of skill could overcome. VMF 214, Boyington's Black Sheep, lost 30 pilots during their 84 days of combat operations. Think about that. A squadron started with roughly 24 active pilots. They lost more men than they had positions. Replacements came in, flew a few missions, and disappeared into the Pacific's blue expanse with a green hell of jungle islands. Pappy Boyington himself was shot down on January 3, 1944, during his 26th kill. He spent 20 months in Japanese POW camps, enduring treatment that broke many men. When he finally came home, the war hero was a shadow of the aggressive fighter pilot who had led his men into impossible odds. Was it worth it? The men who flew the Corsair would tell you yes, but not without hesitation, not without the weight of lost friends behind their words. The plane demanded everything. In return, it gave you a chance. In a war where chance was the most precious commodity, perhaps that was enough. The Corsair didn't retire when the war ended. It fought in Korea, shooting down MiG-15 jets in the hands of skilled pilots who understood that speed and durability could sometimes overcome technological disadvantage. It served with foreign air forces into the 1960s. The last combat mission by a Corsair was flown in 1969 by Honduras during the football war with El Salvador, 24 years after World War II ended. Think about that longevity. An aircraft designed in 1938 was still flying combat missions when humans were walking on the moon. Today, only a handful of Corsairs still fly. They appear at air shows, their distinctive GO wings and thunderous engines reminding crowds of an era when machines were as much character as capability. When you hear that R-2800 roar to life, you're hearing the same sound Kenneth Walsh heard over Guadalcanal, the same sound Pappy Boyington heard over Rabaul, the same sound Robert Klingman heard as he deliberately flew his propeller into an enemy plane at the edge of space. The Corsair Museum in Stratford, Connecticut preserves the history. The Museum of Flight in Seattle has one. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola maintains several. Each one is a monument, not just to engineering, but to the humans who mastered a difficult machine in the service of something larger than themselves. The plane that was too dangerous for the Navy became one of the most successful fighters of World War II. The Ensign Eliminator became the mount of aces. The bent-wing bastard became beloved. What changed? The plane didn't, not fundamentally. The pilots did. They learned. They adapted. They respected the machine's demands and harvested its capabilities. They turned a problem into a legend. There's a lesson in that for all of us. If you ever get the chance to see a Corsair fly, go. Stand by the runway when it takes off. Feel the ground shake as that massive engine spools up. Watch those gull wings bite into the air. Listen to the thunder. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're 23 years old, thousands of miles from home, strapped into that cockpit with 6.50 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. Imagine enemy fighters diving from the sun. Imagine the stick in your hand, the rudder under your feet, the throttle waiting for your command. Imagine the courage it took. Now, open your eyes and be grateful you're only imagining it. The men who flew the Corsair, Kenneth Walsh, Pappy Boyington, Robert Hanson, Robert Klingman, and thousands whose names we never learned, didn't have imagination as an option. They had only the mission, the moment, and the machine. They climbed into the bent-wing bird and they flew into history. Every Corsair that still flies is their memorial. Every time that engine roars, it's speaking for them. It's saying, we were here. We fought. We sacrificed. We mattered. Listen to that sound. Remember, the Corsair wasn't just a fighter plane. It was a crucible that transformed frightened young men into warriors, that turned engineering compromises into battlefield advantages, that proved sometimes the difficult path leads to extraordinary destinations. In the end, maybe that's what the bent-wing bird really teaches us, that the things worth doing are rarely easy, that machines reflect the character of those who master them, and that history is written not by perfect tools, but by imperfect humans who refuse to quit. At 14:32 hours on April 11, 1945, Robert Klingman made an impossible choice. He survived because his Corsair was tough enough to absorb the impossible and keep flying. 70 years later, that same spirit endures, in the museums, in the air shows, in the memories of veterans who remember when the bent-wing bird ruled the Pacific skies. The Corsair's war ended in 1945. Its legend never will.